Hey, Ghost Seekers, you're listening to the Limitless Man podcast. Today, we're diving deep into Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score. It's a pretty intense topic, but super important if we want to really understand how trauma shapes us. And we're not just talking about like big T trauma here, but any experience that's been overwhelming. We're going to look at how trauma changes our brains, how it gets kind of stuck in our bodies, and even messes with how we connect with other people.
Yeah, one of the things that really struck me about this book was how it brings together years and years of clinical experience with the latest discoveries in neuroscience. So it's not just some theory, it's like real practical insights into how trauma affects us on a physical level.
Right, like it's not just a matter of just like getting over something. Trauma changes us, like deep down changes how we work. Honestly, the book really opened my eyes to how much we tend to underestimate that physical side of trauma.
Yeah, I think that's a really common misunderstanding. We think of trauma as, purely psychological, but van der Kolk shows us just how much it actually gets embedded in our bodies.
Okay, so let's break this down for our listeners. Why is it so important to understand how trauma affects us?
Well, first off, trauma is way more common than most people think. It's not just war zones or huge disasters. The numbers on child abuse and domestic violence alone they're pretty scary. Basically, trauma can happen to anyone, anywhere, and understanding how it works can be, life-changing.
Yeah, it's like you hear about PTSD, but you don't really think about how everyday stuff can lead to similar struggles.
Exactly, and that's why understanding how trauma rewires the brain is so important. Think of the amygdala as like your brain's alarm system. After trauma, that alarm system can get stuck, in the on position, leading to anxiety, always feeling on edge.
Oh yeah, I was reading about how trauma can actually shrink the hippocampus, the part of the brain that handles memory. It makes sense now why people who've experienced trauma might have these vivid but fragmented memories, or even struggle to remember things clearly.
Yeah, that's exactly the kind of impact van der Kolk is talking about, and it goes even further than that. Trauma can also mess with the prefrontal cortex. That's the part of your brain that's in charge of decision-making and emotional control. So not only are you more prone to fear and anxiety, but it also becomes harder to manage those feelings, to think straight, or even control your impulses.
Wow, so trauma really throws a wrench in the whole system, huh?
Yeah.
And this is where that central idea from the book comes in. The body keeps the score.
Yes, that's one of the most important takeaways from the book. The body remembers what the mind might try to forget. Like, think about how your muscles tense up when you're stressed. Now, imagine that tension becoming chronic, a constant state of bracing for impact. That's one way trauma can show up physically.
It's almost like our bodies are holding on to the experience, even if our minds have moved on.
That's a great way to put it. And these physical sensations can be really intense. Van der Kolk calls them somatic memories. They're like physical echoes of the trauma that linger, even if you don't have a clear memory of the event.
So we're talking about things like chronic pain, tightness in the chest, or maybe that feeling of always being on edge.
Exactly. And it all ties back to how our nervous system deals with stress. There's the sympathetic nervous system, that's your fight or flight response, and then there's the parasympathetic system, which helps you calm down. But trauma can disrupt this whole balance, leaving you either constantly on high alert or completely shut down.
So it's like being stuck in either constant tension or complete numbness. It's easy to see how either extreme would make it hard to live a normal life. This is getting pretty intense, I have to admit. Suddenly, I'm noticing all sorts of tension in my own body.
That's a great example of mindfulness at work, and it highlights another crucial point from the book. Becoming aware of your body's signals is the first step to understanding how trauma might be affecting you.
So it's not about ignoring those feelings or pushing them away. It's about tuning in to what our bodies are trying to tell us.
Exactly, and that's especially important when we talk about developmental trauma.
Developmental trauma. That's trauma that happens during childhood, right? Like before the brain has fully developed.
Right, and it can have a huge impact on how you function as an adult.
Yeah.
Imagine how hard it is to trust people after being betrayed. Now imagine that distrust being a core part of you from a young age. That's the legacy of developmental trauma. It shapes everything from your emotional responses to your ability to form healthy relationships.
Wow, that really puts it into perspective. It makes you realize just how crucial those early years are for setting the stage for our adult lives.
And it doesn't have to be some big dramatic event either. Even things like emotional neglect or inconsistent caregiving can have a huge impact on a developing brain.
So things like not having your emotional needs met as a child, or maybe having a parent who was unpredictable with their affection.
Exactly. And those experiences can really shape how you connect with others later in life.
So how do we even begin to heal from all of this? I mean, it can feel really overwhelming when you start to realize just how much trauma might be at play.
That's a great question, and Kolk tackles that head-on in the book. He says healing isn't just about talking about the trauma, it's about addressing it on a physical level, too.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice? What kind of tools are we talking about?
Well, one of the most powerful tools is actually mindfulness. It might sound simple, but learning to pay attention to your breath, to your body, to your emotions, without judging yourself, it can be incredibly powerful. It helps to calm that overactive alarm system in your brain and gives you back a sense of control.
So instead of being overwhelmed by, let's say, a wave of anxiety, you learn to ride that wave.
Exactly. And Kolk also talks a lot about body-based therapies like yoga, somatic experiencing, and EMDR. These approaches can help to release that tension that gets trapped in the body and help to re-regulate your nervous system.
I've heard a little bit about EMDR, but I'm not sure I fully get it. Can you explain that a bit more?
It's pretty interesting. It involves bringing up the traumatic memory while you're also focusing on something external, like eye movements or tapping with your hands. This kind of dual attention helps to unstick the memory, allowing your brain to process it in a healthier way.
So it's kind of like rewiring the brain to respond differently to those memories.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And the book also highlights the importance of neurofeedback, which is basically like biofeedback for your brain.
I gotta admit, that sounds a little sci-fi to me.
Haha, it might sound futuristic, but it's a real thing, and it's showing a lot of promise. It uses sensors to track your brainwave activity, and then gives you feedback, often through games or visuals. That helps you learn to shift your brainwave patterns into a healthier state.
It's amazing to think we can actually train our brains to regulate themselves. It really underscores how connected the mind and body are. Like, you can't really separate them when it comes to healing.
And that's a major takeaway from The Body Keeps the Score. It challenges us to see healing as a holistic journey, one that addresses the physical, the emotional, and even the relational aspects of trauma.
So where do we go from here? For someone listening to this, what are some of the key things they can start doing in their own lives?
That's a great question. Maybe we can dive into some practical tips for our listeners in the next part of our deep dive.
Sounds good to me.
Welcome back, Growth Seekers. Before the break, we were talking about putting all this knowledge from The Body Keeps the Score into action. So let's get practical. What can our listeners do today to start addressing the impact of trauma in their own lives?
That's a great question. I'm sure a lot of people listening are wondering the same thing. You know, if you feel overwhelming to know where to even start.
Yeah.
Especially when we're talking about something as complex as trauma.
Absolutely. So let's break it down into some manageable steps. One of the most powerful things you can do is start tuning into your body. Pay attention to any areas of tension, pain, or even numbness. Those sensations could be signals that there's some unresolved trauma you need to address.
You know, I think a lot of us are so used to living in our heads that we forget to listen to what our bodies are trying to tell us. It's like we've become disconnected from those physical sensations.
That's a really important point. So a good first step is simply to start noticing. Maybe set a timer on your phone a few times a day. Just take a moment to check in with your body. What sensations are you feeling? Where are you holding tension?
You know, as you're saying this,
Yeah.
I'm realizing I tend to clench my jaw when I'm stressed. I never really made that connection before. It's amazing how much we can learn just by paying attention.
And once you start paying attention, you can start exploring different ways to release that tension. This is where body-based practices can be really helpful. Things like yoga, tai chi, or even just going for a walk in nature.
Oh, I love that you mentioned walking in nature. It's so simple, but so powerful. For me, even just a few minutes outside can really shift my mood and help me feel more grounded.
And don't underestimate the power of mindful breathing. Even a few minutes each day can make a huge difference in calming your nervous system. It's like hitting the reset button on your stress response.
Okay, so we've got paying attention to our bodies, moving our bodies, and being mindful of our breath. What else can we add to our trauma healing toolkit?
This one might sound obvious, but it's crucial. Cultivate safe and supportive relationships. Surround yourself with people who listen without judgment, offer empathy, people who make you feel seen and heard.
You know, it's funny, when I think about the times I felt most overwhelmed or stressed, it's often been because I was trying to deal with things on my own, instead of reaching out for support.
That's so common, and it makes sense. Trauma can make us withdraw and isolate ourselves, but connection is essential for healing.
And that connection doesn't have to come just from romantic partners or close family. It can be friends, colleagues, support groups, even online communities. It's about finding those spaces where you feel safe to be yourself, vulnerabilities and all your.
And remember, you're not alone in this journey. Trauma is more common than you might think, and there are tons of resources out there to support you.
Speaking of resources, we talked earlier about how The Body Keeps the Score offers not just insights, but also practical tools for healing. What stood out to you as particularly useful?
One of the most profound concepts for me was the idea of pendulation. Kolk uses this term to describe the back and forth movement between feeling overwhelmed by trauma and feeling safe and resourced. He emphasizes that healing isn't linear. It's a process of gradually expanding your window of tolerance for difficult emotions.
So it's not about avoiding those difficult emotions altogether, but learning to navigate them in a way that feels manageable.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging that there will be ups and downs, and that's okay. The goal is to gradually build your capacity to stay present with those feelings without getting completely swept away by them.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like building up your emotional resilience, one step at a time.
And that leads into another really important point. Be patient with yourself. Healing from trauma takes time, and there's no one-size-fits-all approach. What works for one person might not work for another.
It's so easy to fall into that trap of comparing ourselves to others, or thinking we should be over it by now. But healing isn't a race.
And this is where self-compassion becomes so crucial. Treat yourself with the same kindness and understanding you would offer a dear friend who's going through a difficult time.
I love that. It's a good reminder that we can't heal from trauma by being hard on ourselves. We need to cultivate that inner sense of gentleness and support.
And remember, setbacks are a normal part of the process. If you find yourself slipping back into old patterns or feeling overwhelmed, don't beat yourself up about it. Just acknowledge it, offer yourself compassion, and gently guide yourself back to a place of safety.
You know, one of the things I've been thinking about as we've been talking is the role of language in healing from trauma. Kolk talks about how trauma can often leave people feeling speechless, like words can't capture the intensity of their experience.
That's a really insightful observation. It's like the trauma exists outside the realm of language, making it incredibly difficult to express or even understand.
And yet there's also this idea that putting our experiences into words can be incredibly healing. It's like creating a narrative that helps us make sense of what happened.
It's a delicate balance, isn't it? On one hand, language can help us process and integrate our experiences. On the other hand, it can feel profoundly inadequate to capture the enormity of what we've been through.
It's like trying to describe a color you've never seen before. There are no words that can truly convey the experience.
And that's where those alternative forms of expression become so important. Things like art, music, dance, or even just spending time in nature and allowing yourself to feel your emotions without judgment.
It's like finding a language that speaks to the soul, rather than just the mind.
And sometimes the most healing language is simply the language of silence, creating a space where you can just be present with yourself without the need for words or explanations.
That's a powerful reminder. Sometimes the best way to heal is to just allow ourselves to be.
And that brings us to another key aspect of healing, the power of connection. Trauma isolates us, but healing happens in relationship. It's about reaching out to others, allowing ourselves to be seen and heard, realizing that we're not alone in this journey.
It's like rebuilding those neural pathways of connection that were damaged by trauma.
And that connection doesn't have to come just from therapists or support groups. It can also come from connecting with nature, with animals, with spiritual practices, even with creative pursuits. It's about finding those things that nourish your soul and remind you of your wholeness.
It's like rediscovering those parts of yourself that were hidden or buried by the trauma.
And speaking of rediscovering parts of yourself, one of the most fascinating and empowering concepts in The Body Keeps the Score is the idea of internal family systems, or IFS.
I've heard a little bit about IFS, but could you explain it for those who might not be familiar?
Sure. It's this fascinating idea that we all have different parts within us. Think of it like an internal family. There's a protector, the critic, the child, the nurturer, and so on. Each part has its own unique voice, its own needs, and its own intentions.
It's like a cast of characters living inside our heads.
Exactly. And trauma can throw these parts out of balance. For example, the protector might become overactive, leading to constant anxiety and hypervigilance. Or the critic might become incredibly harsh and self-sabotaging.
So it's not just about healing from the trauma itself. It's also about learning to understand and manage these different parts of ourselves.
That's exactly it. And this is where the concept of self-leadership comes in. Van der Kolk argues that the key to healing is to cultivate a sense of self, a core of wisdom and compassion that can lead and harmonize these different parts.
It's like becoming the CEO of your own internal world.
That's a great way to put it. It's about learning to listen to the different parts, understand their needs, and ultimately guide them towards healing and integration.
That's a really empowering concept. It's like we have the power within ourselves to create a more peaceful and harmonious internal landscape.
And it's not about silencing or getting rid of any parts. It's about recognizing that they all have a role to play and helping them work together in a more constructive way.
So how do we actually do that? How do we become better leaders of ourselves?
Well, the first step is awareness. Just becoming aware of these different parts, their voices, their needs, their intentions. And that's where mindfulness comes in again. It helps us to step back and observe our internal experience without judgment.
So instead of getting caught up in the drama of our internal world, we can learn to witness it with more objectivity and compassion.
Exactly. And then it's about developing compassion for these parts, recognizing that they're all doing their best to protect us, even if their methods are sometimes counterproductive.
It's like being a good parent to our own internal family.
That's a beautiful analogy. And once we have compassion for these parts, we can start to lead them more effectively. We can set boundaries, offer reassurance, and ultimately help them work together for the greater good of the whole system.
I love this idea. It's so empowering to think that we have the capacity to heal not just from external trauma, but also from internal conflict.
And that internal healing can then ripple outward, creating more peace and harmony in our relationships and in the world around us.
You know, one of the things that struck me in the book was the discussion of how trauma can affect our sense of time and memory.
Yeah, trauma can really shatter our sense of a linear narrative. It can make the past feel ever present, and the future feel either terrifying or completely out of reach.
It's like being stuck in this loop of reliving the past, or fearing that the worst is yet to come.
And it can be really disorienting. Suddenly a smell, a sound, a place can trigger a cascade of memories and emotions, transporting you back to the traumatic experience.
It's like those memories are living right beneath the surface, ready to erupt at any moment.
And that's where those body-based therapies we talked about earlier, like somatic experiencing and EMDR, can be so powerful. They help to reprocess those traumatic memories in a way that allows them to become integrated into your life story, rather than continuing to haunt you.
It's like helping those memories find their rightful place in the past, so that they no longer have the power to disrupt the present.
And that's a huge part of healing from trauma. Reclaiming your sense of agency and control. Trauma often leaves people feeling helpless and powerless. But through these various healing modalities, they can begin to reclaim their sense of self and their ability to choose how they respond to life's challenges.
It's like moving from a victim mindset to a survivor mindset.
Exactly. And it's a process, not a destination. There will be setbacks, there will be moments of despair. But the key is to keep moving forward, one step at a time.
And to remember that you're not alone. There are people who understand, there are resources available, and there is always hope for healing and growth.
That's a beautiful message to leave our listeners with. So what are some final takeaways for our listeners who are ready to embark on their own journey of healing from trauma? What are 5 things they can start doing today?
I'm so glad you asked that. This is where the rubber meets the road, right? Where
Yeah.
we take all this amazing knowledge and actually put it into practice.
Exactly. So let's distill this down to 5 actionable steps.
Okay, number 1, pay attention to your body. Notice those areas of tension, pain, or numbness. These could be signs of trauma that need your attention.
Number 2, explore body-based practices, whether it's yoga, tai chi, or even just a walk in nature. Moving your body helps release trapped tension and reconnect with your physical self.
Number 3, cultivate mindfulness. Even a few minutes of mindful breathing each day can do wonders for calming your nervous system and increasing your awareness of your internal state.
Number 4, build a supportive network. Surround yourself with people who listen without judgment, who offer empathy and help you feel safe and seen.
And number 5, and maybe most importantly, be patient with yourself. Healing is a journey, not a destination. Celebrate small victories, acknowledge setbacks without judgment, and know that there is always hope for recovery and growth.
Those are 5 powerful steps towards reclaiming your life from the grip of trauma.
And remember, those steps don't have to be giant leaps. Even small, consistent actions can make a world of difference over time.
Absolutely. It's all about progress, not perfection.
This has been an incredibly insightful conversation, and I'm sure our listeners are feeling empowered to start taking charge of their healing journey.
I hope so. And if you're feeling called to delve deeper into any of the concepts we've discussed today, I highly encourage you to pick up a copy of The Body Keeps the Score. It's a truly transformative book.
Welcome back to the Limitless Man podcast, Growth Seekers. We've been talking about The Body Keeps the Score. And I gotta say, this book has really shifted my perspective on trauma.
Yeah, it's definitely been a game changer for me too. One thing that really struck me was how Kolk weaves together scientific research with real-life stories, It makes these complex ideas so much easier to grasp.
Absolutely. Like, we can talk about the amygdala and hippocampus all day long.
Yeah.
But it's those personal stories, the struggles and resilience of survivors, that really hit home for me.
Yeah, and I think those stories really highlight another key point. Trauma can manifest in so many different ways. There's no one-size-fits-all picture of a trauma survivor.
That's so important,
Yeah.
It's easy to fall into that trap of thinking, well, I haven't gone through that kind of trauma, so this doesn't apply to me. But trauma isn't the competition. Any experience that overwhelms your system can leave a mark.
Exactly. And those effects can show up in really unexpected ways. Like, Kolk talks about how trauma can even impact our physical health, leading to things like chronic pain, autoimmune disorders, even heart disease.
Reading that section really made me think about how often we try to compartmentalize our experiences. We go to the doctor for back pain, but we don't connect it to the emotional stress we're carrying.
That's such a good point. It's like our bodies are literally keeping the score, even when we're not aware of it.
Right, and that's why it's so crucial to approach healing in a holistic way. We can't just treat the symptoms, we have to address the root cause.
I totally agree, and Kolk offers a whole toolbox of empowering ways to do that. We've talked about mindfulness, body-based therapies, neurofeedback, but he also explores some other really fascinating approaches.
Oh, what? Give us a sneak peek.
Well, one that I found particularly interesting was theater therapy. It creates this safe space for people to express their emotions and experiences through things like storytelling, role-playing, improvisation.
That sounds so powerful. It's like giving a voice to the trauma, but in a creative and cathartic way.
Exactly. And then there's EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. We touched on it briefly before. It uses bilateral stimulation, usually eye movements, to help reprocess those traumatic memories.
I know, it's wild, right?
Ah.
Just moving your eyes back and forth can have such a profound effect on the brain.
I know, it's amazing. And Kolk does a great job of explaining the science behind it. He talks about how EMDR helps create new neural pathways, allowing the brain to move past the trauma and integrate those experiences into a healthier narrative.
So it's not about erasing the memories, but changing how our brains react to them.
That's it, exactly. And it all comes back to the concept of neuroplasticity, which we talked about before. Our brains are incredibly adaptable. Even though trauma can have a big impact, we're not stuck with those patterns forever.
That is such a hopeful message. It means we have the power to change, to heal, to create a new reality for ourselves.
And I think that power comes from truly understanding how trauma affects us. It's not about blaming ourselves or feeling broken. It's about recognizing how our brains and bodies have adapted to survive difficult experiences.
And then, with that understanding, we can start making conscious choices. Choices that support our healing.
Yes, it's about taking back our power step by step.
So for our listeners who are feeling inspired,
Yeah.
what's one piece of advice you would offer them as they start this journey?
I would say be curious. Be curious about your own experiences, the way your body reacts to stress, the patterns that show up in your life, and don't be afraid to ask for help. There are so many amazing resources out there, therapists, support groups, online communities. You don't have to do this alone.
That's such good advice. And I'd add, be kind to yourself. Healing from trauma isn't a straight line. There will be ups and downs, moments of progress, and moments of setbacks. But keep moving forward, even if it's just one small step at a time.
Beautifully said. And remember, there's always hope. No matter how deep the wounds of trauma, the human spirit is incredibly resilient, capable of healing and transformation.
The Body Keeps the Score is more than just a book. It's a guide, a companion, and a reminder that we're not alone on this path.
It's a call to reclaim our bodies, our minds, our lives from the grip of trauma.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into The Body Keeps the Score. We hope you found this conversation as insightful and empowering as we did. If you're ready to learn more, we encourage you to check out the book and explore the resources we've mentioned. And remember, healing is possible. Take care of yourselves, growth seekers, and we'll see you on our next deep dive.